Looking back on everything, it's almost embarrassing how long I let myself ignore the signs. I should have seen it plain as day. But after 10 years of marriage, you don't expect your whole life to be turned on its head. When you trust someone that deeply, you get used to looking past things even if they feel off. I thought that was normal. That's what you do when you're committed. But if I'm honest, maybe I didn't want to see it. Because if I saw it, I'd have to face the fact that Sarah wasn't who I thought she was, and I'd have to deal with what that meant. It started a few months back. Little things, Changes that seemed innocent enough on their own, easy to brush off. Sarah would come home later and later, each time with some reason about a last-minute meeting or a project that her boss just had to get done that night. "Work's been crazy lately," she'd say, with this tired smile that looked just real enough to be convincing. But the first time she came back late, the first night she wasn't home for dinner and missed tucking the kids in, it tugged at something in me, some instinct buried so deep I didn't even want to name it. I remember watching her pour herself a glass of wine, and when she sat down across from me, her face lit by that dim kitchen light, she looked distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. At first, I tried not to think much of it. Everyone has times like that, especially with her job in marketing, where deadlines pop up out of nowhere and clients expect miracles. She'd always been driven, a little too committed to the whole work hard, play hard mentality. So, when she said she had to stay late, I'd handle things at home, make dinner for the kids, and leave something for her in the fridge. I wanted to be supportive, even if part of me resented how much time she was spending at work. I was doing my best to be understanding because I thought that's what you do for someone you love. But her late nights turned from an occasional inconvenience into something regular, something I started to expect almost every week. And that's when things started clicking into place. She began coming home with this scent, different from her usual perfume. It was faint but just noticeable enough to make me wonder. It had this strange, floral note to it, mixed with something else that I couldn't quite place, something sharper. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake it. Once I asked her about it, something casual like, "Did you change your perfume?" She looked at me like I'd just asked her if she'd stolen the neighbor's car. "Oh no," she said almost too quickly. "Must have been from the office or something. One of the girls sprayed some body spray." She chuckled, trying to brush it off, and I laughed along, but deep down it felt like she was brushing me off. It was such a small thing, but it stuck with me, that half-second of hesitation in her eyes. Then there were the looks she'd give me, those moments when she'd check her phone and get this little smirk like something funny had happened, and I'd ask her what she was smiling about, just out of curiosity. "Oh, it's nothing," she'd say, slipping her phone back into her bag a little too fast. Or sometimes I'd walk into the room and she'd be texting, that same small smile playing on her lips, and she'd turn it off as soon as she noticed me. It was like she was trying to hide a part of her life from me, something I wasn't supposed to see. But then again, who was I to be suspicious? I mean, she was my wife. The woman I'd been with for a decade. We'd been through so much together, moving across states, job changes, and even our son's birth, which had been difficult on her. We had a life that seemed solid, secure. At least that's what I'd thought. I tried to talk to her a few times, ask her if everything was okay. Each time, she'd give me this tired, slightly annoyed look, like I was bothering her with some insignificant question. "Yeah, just work stress," she'd say, and I'd leave it alone, not wanting to push her. But deep down it didn't feel right. I started paying more attention, watching for any little sign, anything that would tell me if something was really going on. I'd catch myself watching her from the corner of my eye, waiting for some slip-up. But she was so smooth, so collected, that if there was something going on, she was hiding it damn well. It ate at me, but I still didn't want to accuse her, didn't want to be that guy, the one who doubts his own wife. Then, a Friday morning rolled around that changed everything. Sarah had been rushing that day, running late for what she called an important client presentation. She was barely awake, grabbing coffee in one hand, her car keys in the other, muttering about how she was going to be late. She didn't even stop for breakfast, just flew out the door with a quick peck on my cheek, saying she'd call me later. I went back to the kitchen to clear up her mug, and that's when I saw it. Her phone lying on the counter where she'd left it in her hurry. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I should have ignored it, should have trusted her. But after all these months of late nights and that damn suspicious perfume and her constant secrecy with her phone, I just couldn't let it go. I stared at the phone, my hand hovering over it like it was some forbidden object, something I wasn't supposed to touch. I kept telling myself to put it down, to trust her, to walk away. But then my hand moved, almost of its own accord, and before I knew it, I'd swiped the screen. A message popped up, the first one on her notifications. It was from someone named Tom. I opened it, every nerve in my body bracing for what I might see. And there it was, "Can't wait to see you tonight, beautiful." Last night was amazing, winky face, it felt like I'd been punched right in the gut. My knees almost gave out and I had to grab the counter just to steady myself. Tom. I tried to think, to remember if I knew anyone by that name, but I came up blank. And then, like a slap to the face, I remembered the young bartender at that place we used to go on our occasional date nights. He was always a little too friendly, with that cocky grin and that habit of pouring a little extra wine in Sarah's glass. I'd never thought much of him, never even bothered to remember his name. But now I was staring at a message from him, telling my wife he couldn't wait to see her. My mind went blank and I couldn't think straight. I just stood there, replaying those words over and over, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare. I sat down, still gripping her phone, and started scrolling through their messages, my hand trembling as I read each one. It wasn't just that one text. There were dozens. Some were casual, others were flirtatious, and a few were intimate. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. They were calling each other pet names, making plans for their next meetup, talking about the fun they'd had. I felt sick. Every night she told me she was working late, she'd been with him. Every time she'd smiled at her phone, it wasn't work emails, it was him. I kept reading, even though it felt like I was torturing myself. I wanted to see everything, every last word they'd said, like I needed to burn the memory of her betrayal into my mind. At one point, I put her phone down, barely able to breathe, my heart hammering like I'd run a marathon. I glanced around our kitchen at the pictures of us on the fridge, the little notes she'd left me in the past, still stuck up with magnets from places we'd traveled together. The reminders of a life I'd thought we were building, a life I'd thought was strong. But it was all just a lie. Every late night, every excuse, it all made sense now. That night, I waited for her to come home. I didn't go to work. I just sat there in the kitchen, replaying everything I'd read, every word they'd exchanged. When she finally walked through the door, she looked at me with that same fake smile, asking me how my day was, as if nothing was wrong. She went straight to the wine, pouring herself a glass, oblivious to the fact that I knew. I watched her carefully, every move she made, wondering how many times she'd done this, come home to me with that same fake innocence, lying straight to my face. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't even flinch, just nodded, taking a sip. "Yeah, you could say that," she replied, not even looking at me as she grabbed her phone off the counter. For a second, I thought I saw a flash of panic in her eyes, like she'd noticed something was off. But then it was gone and she just smiled at me, that same sweet, practiced smile. "Sorry for the late night," she said, barely pausing. "Things are just so busy lately." I felt something snap inside me, this wave of anger mixed with sadness, like a broken dam. But I didn't confront her, didn't demand answers. What was the point? She'd probably deny it, try to talk her way out of it, make excuses. No, I didn't want excuses or apologies. I wanted her to feel the same pain, the same betrayal. Not in some private argument where she could lie her way out of it. I wanted her to see exactly what she'd done, and I wanted everyone else to see it too. I lay awake that night, my mind racing with plans. I knew exactly what I was going to do. After that night, everything felt different. I thought I knew what betrayal was, but the way she'd lied so easily night after night, acting like nothing was wrong, it left a mark on me that I didn't think would ever fade. I went through every moment I'd trusted her without question, every time she told me about late meetings, every time I'd watched her leave the house dressed up and smiling like she was on her way to meet someone special. Turns out she was just not me. That night, as she lay asleep beside me, I made my decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. I'd heard of guys who looked the other way, who accepted the excuses, the apologies, the promises that it was a one-time mistake. I wasn't interested in that. I'd given her everything, my loyalty, my love, years of my life. If she was willing to throw that all away, then she deserved whatever was coming. Over the next few days I kept things quiet. I wasn't about to tip her off. Every time she'd talk about work, I'd nod along, keeping my voice calm, watching her out of the corner of my eye. She didn't seem to suspect anything, which just told me how much she thought she had me fooled. She even had the audacity to smile and laugh, acting like everything was perfect. That only fueled me more. By the end of the week, I'd come up with a plan, and every detail was starting to fall into place. Our anniversary was coming up in just a few weeks. We'd planned a big party, inviting friends, family, a few people from work, the kind of thing where everyone would be there, celebrating what they thought was a strong, happy marriage. I let her think that was still the plan. I even went along with her, acting as if I was excited, telling her I couldn't wait to celebrate together. She smiled, looking at me with those same lying eyes, and I fought the urge to confront her right then and there. No, I told myself, just wait. The hardest part was the nights. Lying there next to her, knowing she'd been with someone else, feeling like she'd brought that other guy into my home, into my bed, into our life together. There were times I'd look at her and feel this rage bubbling up inside me like I was about to snap. But I'd take a deep breath, remind myself of the plan, and turn over, pretending to be asleep. In the days leading up to the anniversary, I put everything in motion. I'd been gathering all the evidence I could find, the messages on her phone, the texts, anything that proved what she'd been doing. I printed out copies of the text, saved screenshots, even managed to find some emails she'd sent him. All of it laid out in black and white. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, there'd be no denying it. When I told Sarah about the party arrangements, she seemed excited, almost relieved. I could see it in her face. She probably thought this was my way of telling her I was still committed, that I'd forgiven her for all those late nights at work. She even kissed me on the cheek, looking at me with that same smile I used to love, the one that now made my stomach turn. The night before the party, I barely slept. I lay awake thinking about what I was going to do, wondering if I'd be able to pull it off. But the anger, the betrayal, all of it pushed me forward. When I got up the next morning, I knew there was no going back. I was committed. I'd arranged for a slideshow to be played during the party. Originally, we'd planned it to be a collection of photos from our life together, wedding pictures, vacation shots, the kind of thing that would show off all the good times we'd shared. I kept that plan, only now it was going to show a little more. I kept the original photos, the memories from the early days, the ones that made it look like we were a happy couple. But I'd also added a few extra slides. The texts, the pictures, the proof of everything she'd been hiding from me. I wanted her to see it unfold in front of everyone, to feel the weight of every single lie she'd told. The party started around 7. Friends and family trickled in, congratulating us, toasting to many more happy years together. It was almost surreal watching them laugh, joke, and celebrate with us, all while I knew the truth. Sarah was in her element, chatting with everyone, smiling like she was the happiest woman in the world. She even gave me a little wink from across the room like she thought we were still on the same page, still in love. Made me sick. I went along with it, playing the part of the doting husband, smiling, laughing, acting like I hadn't seen the texts, hadn't read her plans to meet Tom in some cheap hotel. Every time she'd look at me, I'd smile back, keeping my anger buried just deep enough to stay calm. But inside, I was counting down the minutes until the moment I'd planned. Around 9, I tapped my glass, calling everyone's attention. The room went quiet and I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, curious, maybe a little surprised. I cleared my throat, making a little speech about how much this anniversary meant to me, how grateful I was for everyone being there to celebrate with us. I watched Sarah's face as I spoke, saw the way she smiled, her eyes misting over just a bit. She looked happy, almost relieved. She thought she'd gotten away with it, that her lies had worked, that I was the same trusting fool she'd been sneaking around on all this time. I gave the signal and the lights dimmed. The first few slides were just as planned. Wedding pictures, vacations, birthdays, all those moments we'd shared, the ones that had once meant something. People were smiling, clapping, a few even wiping away tears, and I could see Sarah's face soften, like she was getting swept up in it all. I almost felt sorry for her, watching her smile at those memories, seeing how she was starting to believe that everything was okay. And then the screen shifted. The first message from Tom appeared on the screen, his words in bright, glaring letters. "Can't wait to see you tonight, beautiful." I watched the room go still, a few people exchanging confused glances, some shifting uncomfortably, whispering to each other. I looked over at Sarah and for the first time I saw her smile falter. Her face went pale, her eyes widening as the next message popped up, and then the next, each one worse than the last. There were gasps, muttering, and then silence as people started to realize what they were seeing. The texts, the pictures, everything she'd been hiding. I could feel the tension in the room, could feel the eyes turning from the screen to Sarah, then back to the screen, piecing it all together. I didn't look at her, I couldn't. I just stared straight ahead, watching her world come crashing down the same way mine had. By the time the last slide faded, the room was dead silent. I finally turned to look at her, saw her standing there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to speak, trying to say something, anything to make it stop. But there was nothing she could say. Nothing that would change what she'd done. Nothing that would undo the betrayal that was now on full display for everyone to see. I didn't feel satisfaction, not exactly. There was no pleasure in watching her suffer, no joy in seeing the hurt on her face. But there was a strange kind of relief, a weight lifting off my shoulders as I finally let go of the anger, the resentment, the bitterness I'd been carrying around for so long. She'd broken our trust, shattered our life together, and now everyone knew it. There was no hiding, no pretending. Sarah finally managed to speak, her voice shaking, her eyes darting around the room, desperate, pleading. "Please everyone, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, but her words fell flat. I could see the way people were looking at her, the judgment in their eyes, the disappointment, the disgust. She tried to come over to me, reaching out, her face crumpling as she whispered my name, begging for a chance to explain. But I stepped back, letting her hand fall to her side. The party was over. The silence after that slideshow felt heavy, like everyone was afraid to move, to break the tension hanging in the air. My heart was racing, but I kept my expression steady. Sarah looked stunned, frozen in place as she glanced around the room, her eyes darting to each person like she was looking for some kind of escape. Her face was pale, mouth open slightly, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. A few seconds passed before she managed to take a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. "John. Please," she started, reaching a hand out to me, her eyes full of desperation. "Can we just talk about this?" She was whispering like it was some private conversation and not a party full of people who had just watched her entire betrayal flash across the screen. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, how she was acting like we could just sweep this under the rug, pretend none of it had happened. Around us, people were whispering, exchanging glances, not sure whether to leave or stay. My sister leaned over to my brother-in-law, whispering something with a look of pure shock. My buddy Chris, who I'd known since college, stood there with his mouth hanging open, his beer halfway to his lips. I looked around at all of them, all the people who'd been there for every important moment of our marriage, every milestone we'd hit together, and now, every one of them had seen the truth. "John," Sarah tried again, her voice louder this time with a crack in it. She glanced at her parents who were standing by the doorway, their expressions a mix of shock and horror. Her mom looked as pale as a ghost, her hand over her mouth. Her dad stood stiff, his jaw clenched. I could tell he didn't know what to do or say, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I ignored her, turning to everyone else instead, letting her hand fall back to her side. "I'm sorry everyone had to see that," I said, keeping my voice calm, steady, even though my blood was boiling under the surface. But it seemed fitting that, after all these years of thinking we had a perfect marriage, everyone finally gets to see the truth. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make a scene. I just said it flatly, letting the words hit her, watching as her face crumpled. "John, please," she whispered, her voice so quiet now, like she was barely holding herself together. "Please, can we just talk? Just the two of us." I looked at her, then really looked at her, and saw the woman I'd thought I knew. The woman I'd loved, trusted, given my whole life to. But she wasn't that woman anymore. I shook my head, keeping my voice even. "Talk? You want to talk now after all this?" She opened her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "It's not what you think. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I never meant for it to happen. I was lonely, and I didn't think you cared anymore." She was rambling, her words coming out in a rush, desperate to find some way to explain herself, to make this all go away. "You don't understand, John, it just happened." "It just happened?" I repeated, my voice cold, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles were turning white. "You think all of this just happened? All those late nights, the lies, the sneaking around?" I looked around the room, catching the eyes of our friends, our family, watching their expressions shift from shock to disgust. "It didn't just happen, Sarah. You made it happen. Over and over, you chose him over me, over our marriage, over everything we built." She shook her head, the tears spilling over, her voice breaking as she reached for my arm. "John, please. I know I messed up, I know I hurt you, but I never meant to what?" I cut in, stepping back from her reach. "To hurt me? You didn't think of that while you were sneaking around with him, while you were lying to me every single night, telling me you were at work?" I didn't raise my voice, didn't shout. I didn't have to. The weight of every lie, every betrayal was heavy enough without adding to it. For a moment she was quiet, her shoulders slumping as the reality of what she'd done seemed to hit her. But then her eyes hardened and she squared her shoulders, her mouth set in a tight line. "You're no saint, John. You don't get to stand there and act like you're perfect. You've ignored me for years, made me feel like I didn't even exist. I was lonely. And Tom, he made me feel wanted, like I mattered." Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. I kept my expression calm, my voice steady. "So, that's your excuse? That you were lonely?" I shook my head, disgusted. "There were a lot of ways you could have dealt with that, Sarah. You could have talked to me. We could have gone to counseling. Hell, you could have just told me you weren't happy. But instead you went behind my back. You made a choice over and over again. And now you get to deal with the consequences." The room was dead silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on us, the tension thick in the air. Sarah's friends, who'd been giggling and drinking wine just an hour ago, now stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. Her best friend, Lisa, kept glancing between Sarah and me, her hand on her mouth, looking like she wanted to disappear. For a second, Sarah's anger faded and she looked scared. Like she was realizing, maybe for the first time, that she couldn't talk her way out of this, that there was no version of this where she came out looking like the victim. She turned to her parents, her voice trembling. "Mom, Dad, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Her dad's face was like stone, his lips pressed into a tight line, his eyes cold. "We raised you better than this, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice full of disappointment. "You're a grown woman and you made a choice. Now you have to live with it." She opened her mouth, a desperate look in her eyes, but he held up a hand, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it, Sarah. Not now." Her mother was crying silently, shaking her head, refusing to look at her daughter. I could see the shame in her eyes, the hurt. Sarah turned back to me, her expression pleading, like she still thought there was a chance to fix this, to undo everything. "John, please, I'll do anything. We can go to counseling, we can work on this, I'll make it up to you, I swear. Just give me a chance." Her voice broke and she reached for me again, her hands shaking. "I don't want to lose you." But I was done. Whatever we'd had, whatever love I'd felt for her, it was gone. She'd taken that trust, that love, and destroyed it piece by piece with every lie, every excuse. I looked her in the eye, letting her see the finality in my expression. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm, "we're done. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." Her face crumpled and she looked like she was going to fall apart right there in front of everyone. I turned away, walking toward the door, the tension in the room following me like a shadow. Behind me, I could hear her start to cry, soft, broken sounds that might have moved me once. But now they just felt hollow, empty. As I reached the door, Chris stepped up beside me, putting a hand on my shoulder, his expression a mix of sympathy and disbelief. "John, man, I don't know what to say," he murmured, shaking his head. "I had no idea. I thought you two were rock solid." I nodded, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah, so did I." I looked around the room one last time, seeing the faces of everyone who'd once thought Sarah and I were the perfect couple, the ones who'd come to celebrate our life together. And now they were witnesses to the truth, to the betrayal that had shattered everything. I left the house, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I walked down the driveway, not even sure where I was going, just needing to get away from the chaos, from the pain. I'd spent so many years building a life with her, thinking we'd be together forever. And now it was all gone, torn apart by her lies, her betrayal. For a long time I just walked, my mind blank, the numbness spreading through me. I thought this would bring me some kind of closure, some sense of satisfaction, but all I felt was emptiness. The weight of everything we'd lost, everything we'd thrown away, pressed down on me, suffocating. Eventually, I found myself at the park where Sarah and I used to go on our anniversary, the one where we'd had our first date. I sat on the bench, staring out at the dark water, the memories flooding back. The laughter, the promises, the plans we'd made for a future that now felt like a cruel joke. I don't know how long I sat there, but by the time I finally got up, the numbness had started to fade, replaced by something else, something that felt like resolve. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing: I was done with Sarah, done with the lies, the betrayal. I'd make a new life, one that didn't include her. As I walked back to the house, the weight on my shoulders felt a little lighter. There was a long road ahead, full of pain and anger and healing. But for the first time I felt like I could face it. Because now I knew the truth, and I was ready to move on. I didn't go back to the house that night. Couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I spent the night at Chris's place. He didn't ask any questions, just handed me a cold beer, set up the guest room, and told me to holler if I needed anything. That's the kind of friend he'd always been, one of the few people who didn't need me to say anything to know what I was going through. I lay there in the dark, the silence pressing in on me, the whole night replaying in my head on an endless loop. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Chris was making coffee, the smell wafting through the house, almost a comfort. For a split second, I almost forgot everything. But then it all came rushing back. The slideshow, Sarah's face, her pleading eyes, the realization that every part of our life together had been a lie. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of it settle back over me, heavier than ever. Downstairs, Chris was leaning against the counter, sipping his coffee with a kind of cautious look, the kind of expression people wear when they don't know if they're supposed to say something or just let you be. He finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "John, man, I don't know what to say. I mean, I knew something was up last night, but I never expected that. I just nodded, not really trusting myself to speak yet. My throat was tight, the anger and hurt simmering just beneath the surface. Chris looked at me, his eyes full of that same mix of sympathy and shock that everyone at the party had worn last night. Look, he continued, setting his coffee down. I can't imagine what that felt like for you. Hell, I'm still reeling and I was just watching. But you handled it, man. I don't know if I could have kept it together the way you did. He paused as if waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, he went on. So, what now? I took a deep breath, the question hitting me hard. What now? I hadn't thought that far ahead. Last night, all I'd cared about was getting the truth out there, making sure Sarah had to face what she'd done, see herself through the eyes of everyone she'd lied to. But now that it was over, now that there was nothing left to hide, I didn't know where to go from here. I'm not sure, I finally said, my voice rough from lack of sleep. Guess I have to figure out where I stand now that now that everyone knows. I rubbed my hands over my face, feeling the exhaustion deep in my bones. I just wanted her to feel it, you know? To feel what it's like to be betrayed like that. Chris nodded, his eyes understanding. I get it. But you don't have to figure it all out today. You've been through enough. Just take it one step at a time. His words were meant to be comforting, but they didn't quite hit the mark. I wanted to be past it already, to not have to think about her, about the lies, about the future that I'd never get back. I spent the rest of the day in a sort of haze, trying to keep my mind off everything. Chris tried to get me to go out, grab some food, do anything that might distract me, but I just didn't have the energy. I felt like I'd been gutted, like everything I'd known had been ripped away, and all that was left was this empty shell. By the end of the day, I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I needed to face Sarah, to start sorting out what came next. I drove home, my stomach twisting as I pulled into the driveway, half expecting to see her car there. But it wasn't. The place was empty, silent, and for a second I felt a strange kind of relief. I'd have a little more time to pull myself together, to figure out what I wanted to say when she came back. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something on the kitchen counter. A letter, her handwriting on the envelope. I picked it up, the paper feeling too heavy in my hands. I took a deep breath, opened it, and began to read. Dear John. I don't even know where to start. I keep trying to write this to explain myself, but nothing I say feels like enough. I don't know how I could have hurt you like this, how I could have let everything get so far out of control. I've been trying to think back to when it all started, to the moment I first crossed that line, and the truth is, I don't even know. I just know that somewhere along the way I lost sight of what mattered most. I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I never stopped loving you, not really. I know that sounds ridiculous given everything I've done, but it's the truth. I think somewhere along the line I just started to feel invisible. Like maybe I didn't matter as much anymore, like maybe you were too busy, too distant. And then Tom came along and he made me feel seen. I'm not saying that as an excuse. It's not an excuse. I know I've hurt you more than I can ever undo, and if I could go back and change things, I would. I understand if you never want to speak to me again, if this is the end for us. But please, John, if there's any part of you that can forgive me, that can let me make this right, please let me try. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go to counseling, I'll do anything you ask. Just please don't shut me out completely. I can't stand the thought of losing you, of losing everything we built. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you for a chance to fix this, to make it up to you in any way I can. Love, Sarah. Her words blurred as I read them, my vision clouding with a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that she'd just made a mistake, that this was something we could fix. But I knew it was too late. She'd made her choice not once but over and over again, every time she'd gone to see him, every time she'd lied to me. I sat there, staring at the letter, feeling the anger rise up again, hot and suffocating. How dare she ask me for forgiveness after everything she'd done, after she'd humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. She'd made a fool out of me, and now she wanted me to give her another chance? The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. I threw the letter on the counter, unable to stand looking at it anymore. She wanted forgiveness, wanted to make things right, but she'd destroyed everything we had. There was no going back. And as much as I hated to admit it, as much as it hurt to let go of the life I'd built, I knew I had to move on, to find a way to rebuild my life without her. The next few days were a blur of calls, texts, and awkward conversations. Friends and family checked in, offering their support, but I could feel the pity in their voices, the awkward silences, the way they didn't quite know what to say. I could tell they didn't want to take sides, that they were torn between loyalty to me and sympathy for Sarah. It was humiliating, knowing that everyone I cared about had seen the worst parts of my life, that they all knew the truth about my marriage. One evening my mom called, her voice full of worry. "John, honey, I don't know what to say. We're here for you no matter what you decide. I can't imagine how hard this must be, but please don't shut yourself off from everyone. We love you and we're here." I thanked her, trying to sound okay, but I could hear the sadness in her voice, the disappointment. She'd always adored Sarah, thought of her like a daughter. The thought of her knowing what had happened, of her seeing Sarah in that light, broke something inside me. She'd wanted us to make it, to have the kind of marriage that would last, but now, it was all gone. Sarah tried reaching out a few times, leaving messages asking if we could talk. Each time, I ignored her, letting her words go unanswered. I wasn't ready to face her, to hear her excuses. I knew that talking to her would just open the wound wider, make it harder to move on. But as the days went on, the silence started to feel like a weight pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. Finally, after a week, I picked up the phone and called her, my heart pounding as I listened to it ring. She answered almost immediately, her voice a mix of relief and hesitation. "John, thank you for calling. I didn't know if you'd ever want to speak to me again." I kept my voice steady, refusing to let her see how much this was tearing me up inside. "We need to talk about what happens next. About moving forward." There was a pause and I could hear her breath hitch. "Please, John, can't we try to work this out? I know I messed up, I know I hurt you, but I'll do anything to make it right. Just, please give me a chance." I took a deep breath, the words heavy on my tongue. "Sarah, you had every chance. Every single night you came home to me, every time you looked me in the eye and lied, you had a chance. And now it's over. We're over." She started to cry, her voice breaking, but I didn't let it sway me. I couldn't let myself be drawn back into her web of lies. "Please, John, don't do this. Don't throw everything away. We can fix this, I know we can." "No, Sarah. You threw everything away," I replied, my voice cold. "This isn't something that can be fixed. You made your choice and now we have to live with the consequences." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of regret, a flicker of the love I'd once felt for her. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, the way she'd made me feel like a fool. And that flicker vanished. "Goodbye, Sarah," I said quietly, and before she could say anything else, I hung up. Once I ended the call with Sarah, there was a finality in the silence that followed. It was over, truly over, and the weight of it sank in, hitting me harder than I'd expected. For all the anger, all the hurt, this was the woman I'd spent 10 years building a life with, the woman I'd planned a future with. I wasn't just letting go of her, I was letting go of everything we'd built, the home we'd made, the memories we'd created. And in that moment, the grief hit me like a punch to the gut. Over the next few days, I started packing up my things, sorting through a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Each photo, each little memento from a trip or a holiday, felt like a betrayal in my hands, a reminder of all the moments I'd thought were real. Every time I'd catch a glimpse of Sarah's things, her clothes hanging neatly in the closet, her books on the shelf, her coffee mug with that stupid little smiley face she'd insisted on buying, my anger would flare up all over again. It was like living in the ruins of something I'd once cherished, something that had crumbled before my eyes, leaving nothing but painful reminders behind. I took it slow, trying to process each step, not rushing myself. Chris would stop by in the evenings to check on me, sometimes bringing a pizza or a couple of beers, trying to make sure I was eating. He'd sit with me, not saying much, just keeping me company. He knew I wasn't in the mood for talking and he didn't push. That's what I appreciated about him. His quiet presence, his ability to just be there without needing to fill the silence with empty words. I wasn't sure what I'd done to deserve a friend like him, but I was grateful for it. One evening, I was sitting in the half-empty living room, surrounded by boxes, when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my stomach clenching as I saw Sarah's name on the screen. I hadn't heard from her since that last call, and part of me had hoped she'd finally gotten the message, that she'd stopped trying to reach out. But apparently she hadn't given up. I stared at the message, torn between the impulse to delete it and the need to see what she had to say. "John, I know I don't have the right to ask, but could we meet? Just once? I need to say goodbye. I need to have one last chance to apologize face to face. I understand if you don't want to, but please. I'm asking for closure." The word closure jumped out at me, making me shake my head. Closure. What did she think this was, some breakup from college? We were adults, married, with lives that had been intertwined for years. There was no closure for something like this. There was only moving on, rebuilding, learning to live with the hurt. But then again, maybe I needed this too. Maybe seeing her one last time, facing her as the stranger she'd become, would give me a chance to close the door on this chapter of my life once and for all. I texted back, agreeing to meet at a nearby park the next day. When I hit send, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. This would be the last time. After this, there would be nothing left to say. The next day, I arrived at the park early, walking along the path until I found a bench near the lake, away from the crowds. I sat down, watching the water ripple in the breeze, feeling the chill in the air. Fall was coming on fast, the leaves turning shades of orange and red, the smell of them filling the crisp air. It felt like the end of something, the closing of a chapter. I sat there, my thoughts drifting as I waited, not sure what I was going to say, not sure if I'd even have the words. Sarah showed up a few minutes later. I saw her before she saw me, her shoulders slumped, her expression worn, her steps hesitant. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of what she'd done had finally started to settle on her. She spotted me and walked over slowly, standing a few feet away, her hands twisting together nervously. "Thanks for meeting me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know if you would." I didn't reply right away, just looked at her, taking in the sight of her, trying to reconcile this woman with the one I'd loved, the one I'd trusted. She looked different. Maybe it was the weight of everything, the guilt, or maybe it was just me seeing her for who she really was. I gestured for her to sit down, and she took the seat beside me, keeping a careful distance between us. There was a long silence, the only sounds the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional splash from the lake. Finally, she took a deep breath, her hands clenched in her lap. "John, I know I've said it already, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me if I were you. But I needed you to hear it from me, to know that I take full responsibility for everything that happened. It wasn't you. It was me. I made a terrible, selfish choice, and I hurt you in ways I can never undo." I looked at her, trying to feel something other than anger, other than the hollow ache that had settled in my chest since I'd found out. "Why?" I asked, my voice rough. "Why did you do it, Sarah? If you were unhappy, if you were lonely, why didn't you just tell me?" She looked down, her face pale. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish I had an answer that made sense, something I could point to and say, this is why. But I don't. I guess I started feeling like we drifted apart. You were always busy, always focused on work, and I started to feel invisible. I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. And then Tom came along and he made me feel seen." Her words cut deeper than I'd expected. I looked away, staring at the lake, trying to keep the anger from boiling over. "So what? You felt invisible, so you decided to destroy our marriage? You thought betraying me was the best way to solve things?" She swallowed, her eyes filling with tears. "No, I didn't think at all. I was selfish, John. I wanted to feel something, anything, and I didn't care about the consequences. I don't know. I wasn't thinking of you or us or what it would do to you. I was only thinking of myself." I shook my head, the bitterness rising up again. "Well, congratulations, Sarah. You got exactly what you wanted. You made your choice and now you get to live with it." She wiped at her eyes, her shoulders shaking. "I know. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, John. I just wanted you to know that I loved you. I still love you even if I've done nothing to deserve you. You were the best thing that ever happened to me and I threw it all away." Her words hung in the air, raw and painful, but I didn't feel the sympathy she seemed to be hoping for. I'd loved her once, more than I'd thought possible. But now all I felt was a sense of finality, a weight lifting as I finally let go. "I loved you too, Sarah," I said, my voice calm even. "But love isn't enough. You destroyed the trust between us. You made choices that showed me who you really are. And as much as I wish it weren't true, as much as I wanted us to last, we're done. There's no going back." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, her hands twisting in her lap. "I understand. I needed to hear it, to know that this is really the end." "It is," I said, standing up, the finality settling over me. "I hope, for your sake, that you find a way to live with what you've done." I turned and walked away, not looking back. I could hear her soft sobs as I walked, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, feeling the weight lift a little more with each step, feeling the anger and hurt start to fade, replaced by something like peace. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. As I reached the edge of the park, I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. I was free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, the pain. And though it would take time, I knew I'd find my way. I'd rebuild, start fresh, make a life that didn't include her shadow. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of something new. Part 6. Walking away from Sarah that day left me with a strange sense of relief. The worst was behind me, and as painful as it had been, facing her, hearing her words, it somehow closed a door. After that, I began piecing my life back together little by little. I moved into a small place on the other side of town, a modest apartment, just enough space for me to start over. Chris and a few other friends helped me settle in, their support a lifeline I hadn't even realized I'd needed. The days began to blur into a new routine. Work, gym, cooking for myself. Basic, simple things that slowly started to feel like mine again. Friends and family checked in, some more than others. My mom would call, her voice always full of worry, telling me to take care of myself, that I'd get through this. Chris would swing by some weekends to share a beer or watch a game, never mentioning the past, just keeping me in the present. It helped even when I thought it wouldn't. Slowly the ache began to fade, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. One Saturday I decided to revisit the old coffee shop where I used to write years back. I sat down with a fresh notebook, a hot coffee in hand, staring at the blank page. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt ready to fill it, to pour something new into a future I could rebuild without looking back. It'd be a long road, no illusions there. But for the first time in months I could picture it. A new chapter, one I'd write for myself. And that alone was enough.